Fathers. I feel that we live in an at times very gynocentric society that does not really celebrate, revere, or prop up dads and single fathers in the same way that it props up mothers and single mothers. When it comes to family courts, custody rights and laws, alimony, reproductive rights, fathers get the short end of the stick each and every time, it seems. 40% of children put through family court end up losing contact with their father after 2 years. So knowing those numbers and also knowing how crucial and important fathers are breaks my heart. Get a load of these numbers. Sources are in the description. 63% of youth suicides are from fatherless homes. 90% of all runaway and homeless children are from fatherless homes. 85% of children who show behavior disorders are from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts are from fatherless homes. 85% of youths in prison come from fatherless homes. These are just some statistics exemplifying how crucial of a role a father plays in a child's life. I mean, based on these numbers, it's almost a deciding factor as to whether the child is going to be well-adjusted, productive, and successful as an adult. Now, obviously, there's such a thing as deadbeat dads, right? And I'm not gonna sit here and pretend as though there's not a chunk of the children involved in those statistics that come from a dad who skipped out on his responsibilities. Those dads exist, and they suck. You don't realize it until you're an adult, but looking back, it was so important for me to have the more nurturing, soft-spoken, understanding, caring mother, and to have the more stern, stoic, conservative father that I had. And unfortunately, sometimes you lose your parent before you're able to actually come to understand and appreciate them and get out of those sort of rebellious years. That happened to me. My dad died when I was a teenager of cancer, and it was super unexpected. He got sick one day, and less than 2 weeks later, he was gone. So the video is gonna be a little off the track now and a little bit ADHD, but I always tell people, appreciate what you have while you have it. I think oftentimes in the life of a child/teenager, fathers represent sort of an authority figure that may be a little more difficult to connect with than mothers. Dads tend to be, like I said, a little more stoic. Not always, but that is a common trait. That was the case for me. I rebelled against my dad so hard to the point where we had a really bad relationship when I was a teenager, and unfortunately, when he died, we had a bad relationship. It was much easier for me to connect with my mother than it was my dad. My mother was sort of the more liberal, sort of more nurturing force in my life, and my dad was very much more strict, very much more, when are you getting a job? What are your grades like? And that was really all we ever talked about. At the time that my dad had got cancer, I was a senior in high school, and I really didn't have any direction in life. I was, like I said, a bad kid, and our relationship was very volatile to the point where it's so gross to even talk about it, just being an adult now and understanding the ugliness of this, but to the point where I would verbally abuse him, and I would say really mean things, and I would call him names. And it was kind of a mutual thing. He fought with me as well, but I was the worst. You're never guaranteed to have that person around, no matter how much you love them, no matter how much you feel comfortable and safe with them. People can be gone in an instant, and you never want the last thing you said to a person to be bad. One of the last things I ever said to my dad before he passed away was that I hated him, and I called him a really ugly swear word. To this day, that is honestly the biggest regret of my life. I've never made a bigger mistake in my life. It just really sucked to have my dad taken away before I could sort of get a little older and get more mature and understand the ramifications of my actions and my words. And I never got to the point where I could fix my relationship with my dad because we were still in those crazy teenage years, and I was still just really lost, and he didn't really know how to help me. And when I analyze my own beliefs, I think one of the reasons why I've rejected feminism in the way that I have, and how I built a channel around rejecting feminism, is because some feminist literature and some major feminists seem to kind of crap on dads. I will, for the rest of my life, have to live with the fact and the memory that one of the last things I said to my dad was so vicious and so vile and so ugly and so not how I actually felt. And you never want that to be you.
Okay, so I've discussed Blaire White's positions on this channel before. I responded to her before, and I saw this video in her stuff, and I was like, I don't want to attack her for grieving her dad. You know, because you know, it's a bummer. Even when your dad, even when you don't get along with your relatives, you know, and they die, there's baggage left over, and you know, I can understand all that stuff. And in the end, this video is not about calling out Blaire White's feelings for her dad. It's more about responding to her feelings about fatherhood and her feelings about what fathers should be, and her feelings that fathers don't get a fair shake. And you know, additionally, I always hate when people use the phrase single parent household, single mother household in a pejorative sense, because they say fatherless home when talking about why, for example, the black community has a hard time getting by. And they don't talk about how the primary reason for fatherless homes in the modern day is not simply because feminism came to prominence and women started to do it for themselves and they felt like they no longer needed men. The majority of men don't want to leave their kids. You know, the majority of fatherless homes are a product of poverty across all races, religions, creeds. You know, across all that stuff. It's that 9 times out of 10 the father can't afford to provide for the family. There's a sense of shame. There's a sense of inadequacy, and you know, sometimes you believe because they're the mother of their child might actually be more eligible for assistance than the kind of job they themselves can get their hands on. So this is all about desperation and poverty, predominantly about desperation and poverty, but it's being recast by conservatives like Blaire White as a shift in attitudes, as the byproduct of women's empowerment, women in the workplace, and women's liberation, is that men are being rejected from the household and being deprived of their children. You know, she used the term gynocentrism. It's very funny that you know, she's an MRA basically, right, a men's rights activist, and they have this conspiracy theory called gynocentrism, and this conspiracy theory is a response to patriarchy. It's meant to deflect criticisms of patriarchy by saying, no, you are, in a very sort of rudimentary school playground response to the idea of patriarchy, that men and you know, the male identity is privileged in Western societies as much as they are in you know, third world societies, just maybe in a different way. So I mean, my number one go-to for demonstrating to people that patriarchy is a thing is that, you know, Trump won the presidency, and to a different extent, Clinton also took the presidency with outstanding allegations of rape and sexual abuse on their back, and they were voted right in. It was no big deal. That could also be a white privilege thing too, because Barack Obama would not have been elected to office if there was one single complaint from a white woman that he touched her in the workplace in an inappropriate way. So there are layers to that. But gynocentrism is absurd to me because what they mean is matriarchy, and if these Western nations are anything, they're not matriarchies. Actually, there are a lot of Eastern nations, like, you know, the parts of China and parts of Central and South America that are matriarchies. Matriarchies are actually much healthier societies. They're societies that are not wrapped around these very extreme and brutal forms of militarism. They're societies that are not you know, built around you know, war culture and rape culture and all that stuff. So matriarchy is great. Gynocentrism is bullshit, but matriarchy is a much better paradigm than the male figure, the dark father, as the exemplar of moral attitudes and cultural structure. That hasn't worked out for the United States and Western nations at all. So no, men are not a victim of gynocracy. Men are in fact victims of patriarchy. The reason that courts favor women as mothers is because of patriarchal stereotypes that kids need to go with the mother, and that kids don't need the father beyond financial reasons. contributing money. So the only thing that the court really cares about when it comes to fathers is not whether or not they're going to be emotionally engaged in their children's lives, but rather whether or not they're going to send them kids money. And that's about it. That's really what they'll take you to jail for. And again, if you go to the court and tell the court, oh, I have an emotional vested interest in these kids, they'll look at you and go, oh no, well, the mother, Virgin Mary, all that stuff, So it is patriarchy that disadvantages men, and it's so funny that they just embrace it more because it's really what's fucking them. So Blaire White, with this kind of MRA language, goes into, and this is the only thing that I'll talk about her grief that seems strange to me. She blames feminism, because she used to be a feminist, for destroying her relationship with her dad, and not her hateful, conservative, right-wing dad for destroying their relationship with his homophobia. You know what I mean? Like, it's not her dad's fault for hating her for being a gay person as a teenager. It's feminism's fault for teaching her to talk back to her dad and to challenge her dad's homophobia, which I think is an egregious error. To hold a political position of ideology, a philosophy accountable for, it was probably a good idea for Blaire White to talk back to her dad. And yeah, all parents die, and there's always going to be baggage and guilt and regret. But I don't think there's a good case that Blaire White's father was murdered by feminism. I just don't think that's a good case. I don't think that could really hold up in court. So she does give some advice about reconciling with your parents. And yeah, like, if your parents aren't, like, whatever, like, it's fine to, if you feel that you can, without completely destroying yourself, or abandoning your values, your self-worth, you can reconcile with a shitty parent, fine. But, don't crucify, the women's empowerment movement nationwide, globally, because you could not come to terms. Sometimes outrage is justified. Sometimes parents are shitty. Sometimes you shouldn't talk to them. Sometimes they die when you're on bad terms. And no amount of shitting on feminists or men's rights activism is going to reanimate the corpse of an old dead conservative. And no extent of fostering, keeping that person's hateful political views alive is going to resurrect that person or heal any of the relationships or any of that stuff. She also mentioned something about, like, she wants fathers to be stern and detached. So which one is it? Do you want your dad to be a nasty, detached, cold-hearted son of a bitch? Or do you want dads to participate in their kids' lives? Because there's certainly not a good case to give sole custody rights to a man who has no access to his emotions when it comes to his kids, because he's so caught up in toxic masculinity. I've made it clear on this channel before that I myself had a very destructive relationship with my father, and there was a lot of abuse in my household growing up. But if my dad died tomorrow, I'd like to think that, number one, he grew somewhat over time to become more tolerant of progressivism and become more accepting of progressive stuff. But even if he didn't, I'd like to think that if my father died, that I wouldn't try to take up his mantle. You know what I mean? And I wouldn't want to blame things other than myself for being on bad terms and blame my dad. You can't really hold more than the two people in the relationship. Not really. You can't really hold them, feminism, at least not in a vacuum. So societal factors like poverty are one thing, but, like, you can't necessarily point back and go, oh, well, I shouldn't have asked my mean dad to stop calling me queer. That's a reasonable request.